The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl into a flooded cellar where a rusted lockbox exposed a family betrayal. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started. The box lay open between them, the weathered journal and faded photographs inside hinting at secrets long buried. Jake couldn't believe what he was seeing. The name on the photograph was unmistakable, his own. It was a younger version of him, standing beside a man who looked like a familiar stranger. His heart raced as his mind tried to process the sight before him. This was no coincidence. These weren't just random memories or lost family heirlooms. This was something much deeper, something connected to the very core of who he was. The cold air of the flooded cellar pressed in on them, but Jake barely noticed. He was too focused on the revelations unfolding before him. Emma's small fingers continued to flip through the journal, her eyes scanning the pages as if searching for something specific. "What is it, Emma?" Jake asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She paused, her eyes locking with his as if weighing her next words carefully. "This journal," she said softly, "it's about my family. And about you." Jake's breath caught. He had a feeling this wasn't going to be easy. "What do you mean about me?" he asked, leaning in closer. "This was my grandfather's," she replied. "He kept it hidden. He said there were things in here that would explain everything. The truth." The truth about what? Jake's curiosity was piqued now, but he didn't know if he was ready for what might come next. "The truth about what happened to my father," Emma said, her voice trembling. "And about what happened to you." Jake didn't move. His mind raced, but no words came. The journal Emma held in her hands was the key to something he hadn't expected to revisit. He had buried his past long ago, locked it away like a chest of old, forgotten memories. But now, those memories were coming back, and they were coming for him. He stared at the photograph in his hand, the face of a man he hadn't thought about in years staring back at him. The man in the photo was wearing the same Hells Angels patch as Jake. But that wasn't what unsettled him the most. What unsettled him was the fact that this man, the one in the photo, wasn't just anyone. He was someone Jake had known. Someone from his past. Someone who had been part of his life before he disappeared. The name on the back of the photograph made his stomach churn. It was his old mentor, the man who had trained him in the ways of the Hells Angels. The man who had promised to look out for him, to protect him from the darkness of the world. And yet, the photo told a different story. The photo showed the two of them standing side by side, but their eyes told a different tale. The distance between them was clear, even in that frozen moment in time. A betrayal was etched into every line of the photograph, every small detail that Jake had never noticed before. It was right there in the eyes of the man who had once been his mentor, the man who had left him behind when things got too complicated. "Who is he, Jake?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at the photo again, swallowing hard. "His name was Marcus," he said, his voice distant. "He was someone I trusted. Someone who taught me everything I knew." Emma's eyes widened. "Taught you everything?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Jake didn't answer. He didn't know how to explain it. How could he explain to this little girl that her family's past was tied up with his own? That the secrets they both held could unravel in the blink of an eye? He took a deep breath, running a hand through his graying beard. He had spent years running from his past, from the choices he had made. But now, standing here in this flooded cellar with a little girl who knew more about him than he was ready to admit, he realized that running was no longer an option. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. Emma stood up and handed him the journal. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice full of anticipation. Jake hesitated, but finally, he opened the journal, the pages stiff from age. As he read the first few lines, he felt the weight of the words settle in his chest. The journal spoke of betrayal, betrayal that went beyond family feuds and broken trust. It spoke of a hidden fortune, a secret buried beneath layers of lies. And in the pages of this journal, Jake realized that Marcus, the man who had once been like a father to him, had been involved in a plot to steal from his own people. The family Emma had once known was not the innocent, kind-hearted group she believed them to be. They were part of a much darker history, a history that linked their fate to Jake's in ways he had never imagined. "What is it, Jake?" Emma asked, her voice quivering. "What's in the journal?" Jake closed the book, his hands shaking. "It's the truth," he said softly. "The truth about your family. The truth about me." Emma's eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What does that mean?" she asked. Jake looked at her, his heart heavy with regret. "It means we're both in this now," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We have to face what's coming, no matter what it is." As the storm raged outside, Jake knew their journey was only beginning, and the truth they had uncovered was only the first step in a much larger, much more dangerous game. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Emma face it alone. Whatever secrets the journal held, they would face them together. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. The two of them, Jake and Emma, sat in silence in the flooded cellar, the weight of the journal's revelations hanging between them like a storm cloud that refused to break. Jake's mind was racing, processing the truth he had just uncovered. It wasn't just a betrayal of Emma's family. It was a betrayal that had followed him throughout his life. The faces in the photographs, the names in the journal, they were all connected in ways that he hadn't fully realized until now. He had always believed that his past was buried, locked away in the shadows. But now, it was all coming back, like a tidal wave crashing against the dam he had spent years building. Emma looked up at him, her young face still filled with confusion and fear. She had just learned that the man who had been like a second father to Jake, the man who had shaped so much of his life, was tied to the very betrayal that had torn her family apart. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Jake stared at the journal in his hands. The truth was out, but the consequences of that truth were far from clear. He had always been a man of action, quick to make decisions and move forward, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Emma and about her family. He couldn't just leave her to face this alone. "We figure out who's behind all this," Jake said, his voice steady, despite the turmoil inside him. "We find out who sold your family out, and we make sure they can't hurt you anymore." Emma nodded, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. "But how?" she asked. "Who can we trust?" Jake paused for a moment, thinking. He knew the people who could help him, but they were not people Emma would trust. His old brothers, the ones who had been part of the Hell's Angels with him, were not the kind of men who easily let go of their grudges. And the police? They were no help. They had never been part of his world. No, if they were going to find the answers they needed, they would have to rely on their own wits and their own courage. Jake stood up, brushing off his jacket. "I know someone who might have the answers," he said. "But it's not going to be easy to get to him." Emma looked at him, her expression serious now. "Who?" "A man named Steele," Jake said, his tone darkening. "He's one of the old-timers. A former Hell's Angels president. He's the one who knows all the secrets, all the players. If anyone can point us in the right direction, it's him." Emma looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "But if he knows all the secrets, doesn't that mean he's part of the problem?" Jake met her gaze, his eyes hardening. "Steele's not the problem, but he knows who is." There was no more time for hesitation. Jake and Emma had to find Steele before anyone else did. They had to get to the bottom of the betrayal, and they had to do it quickly. "Let's go," Jake said, taking one last look at the lockbox and the journal, then turning to the stairs leading up out of the flooded cellar. "We have to move fast." As they made their way out of the cellar, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a familiar sensation, the kind of feeling that comes when you've spent years running from enemies, always looking over your shoulder. But this time, he wasn't alone. Emma was with him, and she was depending on him to protect her. He couldn't let her down. The journey ahead would be dangerous, filled with obstacles and unknowns. But Jake knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, he wasn't going to let anyone hurt Emma again. They had to uncover the truth, and they had to do it together. As they stepped out into the cold night air, the rain began to fall again. But this time, it didn't feel as heavy. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start in a world full of secrets and lies. And for the first time in a long while, Jake believed that he might just be able to make things right. They had no choice but to face the storm ahead, but Jake was ready. For the first time in years, he was ready to fight for something that mattered. And Emma, the little girl who had uncovered the truth, was right by his side. The night air was thick with tension as Jake and Emma made their way through the winding streets of the town. The rain had picked up again, turning the ground into a slippery mess of mud and water. But Jake barely noticed the discomfort. His mind was focused on one thing: finding Steele, the man who held the keys to the mystery that had plagued his life for years. Emma walked beside him, her small frame slightly hunched against the rain, but there was a new sense of determination in her eyes. She had never imagined that her family's past would be connected to a world like this, the world of betrayal, secrets, and violence. But now, there was no turning back. The truth was out, and they had no choice but to confront it. They reached Steele's place just as the rain began to pour harder. It was an old warehouse on the edge of town, tucked away in a corner where no one would think to look. Jake had been here before, but not in years. The place had always been shrouded in secrecy, a meeting spot for the most trusted members of the old gang. Steele had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. Jake knew that if anyone could help them now, it was Steele. As they approached the entrance, Jake's instincts kicked in. He glanced around, scanning the surroundings for any signs of trouble. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but there was no time to dwell on it. They had to move fast. Emma stayed close to him, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. Jake could see that she was scared, but she was determined to stay strong. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. When they reached the door, Jake knocked twice, a simple signal they had used years ago. After a moment, the heavy metal door creaked open, revealing Steele's broad frame standing in the dimly lit hallway. He was older than Jake remembered, his face more lined with age and experience, but his eyes still held that same intensity. "Jake," Steele said, his voice gruff. "I didn't expect you to come back." "I didn't expect to, either," Jake replied, stepping inside. "But I need answers. And I need them now." Steele stepped aside to let them in. "Come on in. I'm guessing you didn't come all this way for a chat." Jake didn't waste any time. He laid the journal and the photographs on the table in front of Steele, watching his face carefully for any sign of recognition. Steele didn't flinch, but Jake could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Something that told him Steele knew exactly what was going on. "This kid's family," Jake said, his voice low. "They've been hiding something. Something big. And I need to know what it is." Steele stared at the photos for a long time before picking up the journal. He flipped through the pages slowly, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the paper. The room was silent, the only sound the steady drip of water from the ceiling as the storm raged outside. Finally, Steele spoke. "You were right to come to me," he said quietly. "But it's bigger than you think." Jake frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" Steele leaned back in his chair, his face serious. "This isn't just about your past, or Emma's family. This goes back decades, Jake. We're talking about a power struggle, a betrayal so deep that it split the whole damn club in half." Jake's heart sank. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the man you trusted," Steele said, his voice low, "wasn't just some mentor. He was part of a much bigger plan. A plan to take control of everything. Your family, the club, the money, the power." Jake's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The man in the photos, the one who had been like a father to him, Marcus, had been more than just a mentor. He had been involved in something far darker, something that Jake had never suspected. "And Emma's family?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma's family was caught in the middle of it," Steele replied. "They were part of the original plan. But somewhere along the way, things went wrong. They tried to take control, but it backfired." Steele paused, his eyes narrowing. "The lockbox you found, it's not just a family heirloom. It's a key to something much bigger. Something that, if it gets into the wrong hands, could destroy everything." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "What are we talking about here?" Steele leaned in, his voice barely audible. "A hidden fortune," he said, his words hanging heavy in the air. "A fortune that was meant to fund a war. A war for control. But it wasn't just about money. It was about power." Jake stared at Steele, his heart pounding in his chest. He had thought that the past was something he could leave behind. But now, the past had come crashing back, and the stakes were higher than ever. "We need to stop this," Jake said, his voice hard with determination. "We need to find the people who are still pulling the strings and take them down." Steele nodded, his expression grim. "I'll help you," he said, his voice steady. "But we need to be careful. We're Not the only ones looking for that fortune. Jake looked at Emma, who was standing quietly by his side, her eyes wide with fear. He placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice calm. "Together." As the storm raged outside, Jake knew that the real battle was just beginning. They had the answers they needed, but now they had to face the people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The game had changed, and there was no going back. But Jake wasn't afraid anymore. He had a mission, and he was ready to fight for it, no matter the cost. The night was eerily quiet as Jake, Emma, and Steele sat in the dimly lit warehouse, the weight of their discoveries settling on them like a heavy fog. The storm outside had intensified, but inside, the tension was palpable. Jake could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. They had uncovered the secrets, but now the real fight had begun. Steele stood at the table, his fingers tracing the edges of the journal, his expression grim. "We're not the only ones looking for this fortune," Steele said, his voice low. "There are others, people who would kill to get their hands on it." Jake's mind raced as he processed Steele's words. He had known that the stakes were high, but hearing it aloud made it all the more real. "Who are we talking about here?" Jake asked, his voice steady but urgent. Steele looked up from the journal, his eyes narrowing. "The Brotherhood," he said, the words heavy with meaning. "They've been operating in the shadows for years. They've always been after power, after control. And this," Steele gestured to the journal and the photographs on the table. "This is the key to everything." Jake's heart sank as he realized the magnitude of what they were up against. The Brotherhood wasn't just a rival club. They were a network of powerful individuals who had been manipulating events from behind the scenes. And now, they had their eyes on the very thing that Jake and Emma had uncovered. "We can't let them get their hands on it," Jake said, his voice firm. "We can't let them use it to tear everything apart." Steele nodded, his face hardening. "Agreed. But we have to move quickly." They've already started making their moves. Emma, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice soft but determined. "What happens now?" she asked, her eyes filled with fear and hope. Jake turned to her, his heart aching for the little girl who had been thrust into this dark world. "Now," he said, "we fight back. We take the fight to them before they can take it to us." Steele grunted in approval. "I have contacts who can help us. But it's going to take more than just the three of us. We'll need allies, people who owe us favors, people who can move without being seen." Jake nodded, understanding what Steele was saying. They couldn't do this alone. They needed to call in every favor they had left from their days in the club. But the question still lingered in Jake's mind. How far was he willing to go? How far would they all go to protect the truth? "Let's get to work," Jake said, standing up and strapping on his leather jacket. The weight of the decisions ahead felt heavier than ever, but there was no turning back now. They had already come too far. They had to finish what they started. Steele led them to the back of the warehouse, where a hidden door led to a narrow hallway. As they moved through the dark corridors, the sound of their footsteps echoed eerily in the silence. Steele led them into a small room, dimly lit by a single light bulb. On the table in the center of the room lay a map of the city, marked with red XS. Steele pointed to one of the marks. "Here's where we start," he said. "This is where they're holding the next piece of the puzzle." Jake studied the map, his eyes scanning the details. "What are we looking for?" he asked. "The next key," Steele replied. "The next clue that will lead us to the fortune. But it's not going to be easy. The Brotherhood's men will be there, and they'll be waiting for us." Jake didn't hesitate. "We'll be ready." The hours that followed were filled with planning and preparation. Steele made calls, reaching out to old contacts in the underworld, while Jake and Emma gathered the supplies they would need. As the night wore on, the tension in the room grew thicker. The clock was ticking, and Jake knew that. The next move they made would be crucial. As dawn began to break, Steele finally finished his calls and turned to Jake. "We're ready," he said, "but we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it gets." Jake nodded. "Let's do it." They left the warehouse in silence, the weight of the upcoming battle hanging heavy in the air. Emma, though scared, walked with a newfound strength. She had seen the danger, the stakes, but she was determined to face it head-on, just like Jake. They arrived at the location marked on the map, a rundown building on the outskirts of town. Jake surveyed the area, his instincts telling him that something was off. "Stay close," he said to Emma, his voice low and commanding. Steele was already moving toward the entrance, his eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. Jake followed closely behind, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. As they neared the door, Jake felt a sense of foreboding. He had been in countless dangerous situations before, but this time felt different. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something far more important. They were fighting for the truth. The door creaked open, and they stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. They moved carefully, every step measured, every sound amplified in the eerie silence. Jake's heart raced as they approached the center of the room, where a large metal crate sat, its surface scratched and worn. Steele motioned for them to stay back as he slowly approached the crate, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He knelt down and began to work on the lock, his movements precise. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, with a soft click, the lock released. Steele opened the crate, and the contents inside were revealed. It was the next piece of the puzzle, a small, rusted box, similar to the one they had found in the cellar. But this one was different. This one had a symbol on it, a symbol that Jake recognized. It was the same symbol from the photograph, the one that had been associated with Marcus. A chill ran down Jake's spine as he realized that this was just the beginning. The fortune, the power, the betrayal, it was all connected. And they were only getting closer to the truth. The metal crate sat open before them, its contents now exposed to the dim light of the warehouse. Inside, nestled carefully between tattered sheets of old paper and faded photographs, was another lockbox. This one, however, was different. The symbol etched into its surface was unmistakable, a design that was burned into Jake's memory, the same mark that had been on Marcus's patch. The chill running through his body intensified as he realized this box held something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Steele stood beside him, his face grim as he studied the box. "This is it, Jake," he said quietly, his voice low with the weight of the moment. "This is the final piece. The key to everything." Jake's heart raced, his mind flashing back to the photographs, the journal, the decades of secrets that had been hidden away. He had always believed his past was buried, sealed off behind the walls he had built around himself. But now, it was all crashing down on him. "Open it," Jake ordered, his voice firm, despite the unease building in his chest. Steele reached for the box, his large hands steady as he ran his fingers over the rusted edges. Slowly, he turned the box over, finding a hidden latch on the bottom. With a faint click, the latch released, and Steele carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of documents, old, fragile, and filled with handwriting that was nearly illegible. There were also a few more photographs, ones Jake had never seen before. As Steele began to sort through the papers, Jake's eyes landed on a faded letter, its edges curling with age. He reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled it from the box. The letter was addressed to someone named Graham, and it was dated more than 30 years ago. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He stopped himself, his voice tight. "This is from Marcus." Steele looked over at him, his expression unreadable. "From Marcus?" he asked, his tone cautious. Jake nodded, unfolding the letter. The handwriting was familiar. He recognized it instantly. "I know I owe you an explanation," the letter began. "Things have gotten out of control, Graham. I've made deals with people I shouldn't have, and now I'm in too deep. There's something coming, something bigger than we ever imagined, and I'm trying to fix it. But I'm not sure how much time I have left. I need you to get to the lockbox. Everything is in there. You'll understand once you see it." Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew that the lockbox Marcus referred to was the very one they had just opened. The past was coming back to haunt him, and the stakes were higher than ever. "We need to move," Steele said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jake snapped out of his thoughts, looking up at Steele. "What do you mean?" he asked. Steele's gaze hardened. "We're not alone. I can feel it. The Brotherhood is already here." The air seemed to grow heavier as Steele spoke, and Jake's instincts kicked into overdrive. He grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her closer to him. She looked up at him with wide eyes, fear etched across her young face. "What's happening, Jake?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Stay close," Jake ordered, his voice calm but firm. "We're getting out of here." Steele moved toward the door, his eyes scanning the shadows. They know we have the box, he said quietly. They'll be here soon. We need to get ahead of them. Jake nodded, his heart pounding. Let's go. They moved quickly through the dark corridors of the warehouse, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the rain outside. Jake's mind was racing, trying to anticipate the next move, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The streets outside were empty, the usual buzz of activity replaced by the heavy silence of the storm. Jake glanced around, looking for any signs of movement, but all he saw were the shadows of the buildings looming over them. As they neared the motorcycle, Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned, his eyes scanning the darkness, but he saw nothing. Then, in an instant, the silence was shattered. A figure appeared from the shadows, moving swiftly toward them. Jake's hand went instinctively to the handle of his weapon, but Steele stepped in front of him, his expression hard. It's too late for that, Steele muttered under his breath. They've got us surrounded. Before Jake could react, several more figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by helmets and masks. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he realized who they were. The Brotherhood. The very men they had been trying to avoid had found them. Looks like we're not getting out of here so easily, Jake said, his voice low and steady. Steele was already moving, his body tensed and ready for action. We fight, Steele said, his voice cold. We take them down before they take us. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her toward the motorcycle, but before they could reach it, a voice rang out from the shadows. You're not going anywhere, Jake. The voice was familiar, cold, and filled with malice. Jake's blood ran cold as the figure stepped forward, revealing a face he had never expected to see again. Marcus, Jake whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Marcus stood there, his eyes cold and empty, a smile creeping across his face. I knew you'd come looking for answers, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. But now it's too late. The storm raged on around them, the wind howling through the streets as Jake faced his old mentor. The past had come crashing back, and now there was no escape. The final confrontation was at hand, and everything they had worked for was on the line. Jake stood tall, his heart racing, knowing that this fight would be the one that determined everything. And this time, he wasn't backing down. The tension in the air was palpable, each second stretching longer than the last. Jake stood frozen, his mind racing as he faced Marcus, the man who had once been his mentor, his guide through the dark world of the Hells Angels. Now, Marcus was nothing more than a shadow of the past, a figure filled with malice, and the key to the destruction that had been set in motion so many years ago. You're not going anywhere, Jake, Marcus sneered, his voice thick with contempt. His eyes scanned Jake, a cold smile forming at the edges of his lips. Jake's grip tightened on the motorcycle's handlebar, his body tense and ready. Steele stood by his side, his posture stiff, prepared for whatever was coming next. The Brotherhood's men were closing in, their figures blending into the darkness, but Jake wasn't backing down this time. I should have known you were behind all of this, Jake said, his voice calm despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. You always were the one pulling the strings, weren't you? Marcus's smile only grew wider, his eyes glinting with dark amusement. You've got a lot to learn, Jake, Marcus said, his tone almost mocking. It was never about control. It was about survival. And you were just a tool. Jake's pulse quickened, a cold wave of anger flooding through him. He had trusted Marcus once. He had looked up to him, believed in him. Now, standing here, he realized just how wrong he had been. You used me. Jake spat, his words biting through the tension in the air. You used all of us. And for what? Power? Money. Power is just a means to an end, Marcus said, shrugging nonchalantly. And money? Well, it buys freedom, doesn't it? But you wouldn't understand. You've always been the loyal soldier, the one who follows orders. Never questioning. Never seeing the bigger picture. Jake's fist clenched at his side. He wasn't the same man he used to be. The years spent running from his past, hiding in the shadows, had hardened him. He had learned to question, to think for himself. The bigger picture? Jake repeated, his voice low and dangerous. You think this is the bigger picture? You think any of this, he gestured to the lockbox, to Emma, to the mess they had found themselves in, is worth it? The lies, the betrayal, the bloodshed? It's all just a game to you. Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jake could see the flicker of something old, something familiar. But it was quickly replaced by the cold indifference that had always been Marcus's true face. "You never understood, did you?" Marcus said softly. "This isn't about right or wrong. This is about winning. You either play the game, or you get played. And you? You were always too weak to see that." Jake's breath caught in his throat as Marcus's words cut deeper than any knife. The weight of the past, the years of mistakes and regrets, came crashing down on him. But there was no time to dwell on it now. They were past the point of no return. He had to act. Without warning, Jake reached for his gun, the cold metal smooth against his hand. But before he could pull it free, one of the Brotherhood's men lunged at him, knocking him off balance. The air exploded with movement as Steel fought back, throwing punches, taking down the men who had circled them. The sound of boots against the ground, fists landing against flesh, echoed in the tense silence. Emma stood back, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't move. She knew better than to run. This was their fight now. Jake found himself grappling with one of the men, their bodies crashing into the ground. He fought with everything he had, his muscles aching, his mind focused on the one thing that mattered, stopping Marcus and the Brotherhood once and for all. As he shoved the man off, Jake looked up, catching a glimpse of Marcus slipping away, disappearing into the shadows. Jake's heart sank. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Steel!" Jake yelled, pushing himself to his feet. Steel nodded, already moving toward him. "We can't let him get away," Jake said, his voice urgent. Steel was right behind him, his hand gripping Jake's arm tightly. "He's gone, Jake. There's no catching him now," Steel said, his voice grim. "But we can still finish this. We know what he's after. We know where to go next." Jake nodded, his mind already racing. He had always been a man of action, a man who moved quickly, decisively. But this was something bigger. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. "We'll follow him," Jake said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll take him down, and we'll take the Brotherhood down with him." Steel met his gaze, his expression hardening. "This isn't just about the fortune anymore, Jake," he said. "This is about us. About everything we've been fighting for. We finish this, we finish it right." Jake looked at Emma, who stood a few feet away, her face pale, but resolute. She was scared, he could see it in her eyes, but she wasn't backing down either. "We'll get them, Jake," Emma said, her voice steady. "We'll stop them, together." Jake smiled, the first real smile he'd had in days. "Together," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Let's finish this." As the rain continued to fall, Jake, Steel, and Emma prepared for the next move in the deadly game they had been forced into. The past, the secrets, and the lies had led them to this moment. And there was no turning back now. The final confrontation was coming, and Jake wasn't going to let Marcus, or anyone, win. Not this time. The moment Jake stepped out into the cold night, his instincts kicked into high gear. He had been here before, fighting for survival. But this time it was different. This time, it wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about the past he had spent years running from. It was about Emma and everything they had uncovered. As they moved through the empty streets, the weight of their mission pressed heavily on Jake's shoulders. The Brotherhood wasn't just a club anymore. It was a criminal organization, a group with its fingers in every corner of the underworld, and they were closing in. Marcus had been the key, the link between Jake's past and the tangled mess of betrayal that had entangled Emma's family. But now, Jake was determined to finish this once and for all. "Where are we headed, Steel?" Jake asked, his voice steady, but the tension in his muscles was impossible to ignore. Steel, who had been walking silently beside him, didn't answer immediately. He was lost in thought, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Finally, after a few moments, Steel spoke. "We need to get to the old docks. That's where the Brotherhood's been operating out of. They've got their hands in everything, drugs, weapons, money laundering. If we want answers, that's where we find them." Jake nodded, the familiar anger rising in his chest. The Brotherhood had taken everything from him, his freedom, his family, and his peace. But now, they were about to make a mistake. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated Emma. "Let's move," Jake said, quickening his pace. Emma walked beside him, her steps more measured, more careful. Jake could feel the unease in her, but she wasn't backing down. She was in this with him now, and there was no turning back. They arrived at the docks just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The area was eerily quiet, the only sound being the distant crash of waves against the rocks. The ships that usually docked here were gone, leaving the area empty and abandoned. But Jake knew better than to think it was safe. The Brotherhood's presence was like a shadow, always there, lurking just out of sight. Steele led the way, his movements precise and calculated. He knew the area well, and Jake trusted him to guide them through the maze of warehouses and hidden paths. "Stay close," Steele said, his voice low. "This place is full of eyes." They moved swiftly, their footsteps silent on the wet pavement. The smell of salt water mixed with the faint scent of gasoline and oil as they passed by old, rusted shipping containers. Jake's hand rested on the handle of his gun, his body tense, ready for whatever was coming. As they approached a large, decrepit warehouse at the far end of the dock, Steele stopped, raising his hand to signal them to stay quiet. The door to the warehouse was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Jake could make out the figures of several men moving inside. "We're getting close," Steele whispered. "We need to be careful." Jake's pulse quickened. This was it. This was where the answers lay. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. He looked at Emma, who was standing just behind him, her eyes wide with fear, but also determination. She was scared, but she wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to hide. "We'll get through this," Jake said, his voice reassuring. "I promise." Emma nodded, her jaw set in quiet resolve. The time for running was over. They were going to face this head-on. Steele took the lead again, sliding the door open just enough for them to slip through. Inside, the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from a few flickering bulbs overhead. The air was thick with dust and the smell of stale air. The men inside were talking in low voices, their words indistinct. Jake's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room, looking for any sign of Marcus or the rest of the Brotherhood. They were close. He could feel it. Steele motioned for them to move quietly, and they crept through the shadows, their footsteps barely audible. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Jake heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the other side. His heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. Steele turned to him, his expression grim. "We've got company," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, reaching for his gun. He wasn't going down without a fight. They ducked behind a stack of crates, watching as a group of men emerged from the shadows. They were heavily armed, their eyes scanning the room as if expecting trouble. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he recognized one of them. It was Marcus. He was standing at the front of the group, his cold eyes scanning the warehouse. Jake could feel his anger rising again. This was the moment. This was what they had been waiting for. He couldn't let Marcus get away again. As the men moved deeper into the warehouse, Jake signaled for Steele to follow him. They moved quickly, staying low to the ground, their bodies pressed against the crates. Marcus and his men were getting closer, but they hadn't noticed them yet. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Marcus, the man who had once been his mentor, the man who had betrayed him and everything he stood for. It was time to end this. The only question now was how far Marcus was willing to go to protect his secrets. Jake wasn't afraid to find out. The tension in the warehouse was thick as Jake, Steele, and Emma crouched behind the crates, eyes locked on Marcus and his men as they moved deeper into the shadows. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the cold concrete floor, sending a shiver down Jake's spine. He was no stranger to dangerous situations, but this felt different. This time, the stakes were personal. Emma stood silently beside him, her small body trembling slightly from fear, but her expression was resolute. She wasn't running. She wasn't going to hide. And neither was Jake. "We need to move," Steele whispered, his voice low and urgent. Jake nodded, signaling for Steele to follow him. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The time to strike was coming. They waited for the perfect moment, watching Marcus and his men as they gathered near a large steel door at the back of the warehouse. Jake's heart raced in his chest, the adrenaline pumping through his veins as his fingers brushed the grip of his gun. He knew that once they made their move, there would be no going back. The quiet murmur of voices grew louder, and Jake took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the moment. Every decision they had made had led them here, and this was the tipping point. "Now," Jake said, his voice low but firm. Without hesitation, he sprang into action. He and Steele moved in perfect sync, their bodies sliding through the shadows, using the crates as cover as they closed the distance between themselves and the group. Marcus's voice floated through the air, but Jake couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. He was focused on one thing, the man who had betrayed him. They were nearly upon them when one of Marcus's men turned, his eyes scanning the room. Jake's pulse spiked as he froze, but the man didn't see them. His attention drifted away just in time for Jake and Steele to slip past him, moving swiftly and silently. They were in the heart of the action now. Jake's breath was steady as he edged closer to Marcus, the man who had once been a father figure to him, now nothing more than an obstacle in his path. Steele was at his side, moving with the same practiced efficiency. But just as they were about to make their move, Marcus's voice rang out across the room. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "But you're too late." Jake's eyes locked onto Marcus, his fists tightening around the handle of his gun. "It's over, Marcus," Jake said, his voice steady, though a storm of emotions raged inside him. "You've lost." Marcus laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "You think this is over?" Marcus said, taking a step forward. "You have no idea what you're up against. You're just a pawn in a game far bigger than you could ever imagine." Jake's eyes narrowed. "The only game I'm playing is the one where you lose." Without warning, Jake lunged at Marcus, his movements fast and calculated. The sound of gunfire rang out, echoing through the warehouse, but it wasn't Jake who had fired. One of Marcus's men had taken the shot. The bullet whizzed past Jake, grazing his arm. Pain shot through him, but he didn't stop. Steele dove into the fray, taking down one of Marcus's men with a swift punch to the jaw. The fight had erupted, chaos surrounding them as more Brotherhood members appeared from the shadows, weapons drawn, ready to strike. "Stay low," Steele shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed Emma, pulling her down behind a stack of crates. "Stay here and stay quiet," he said, his voice urgent. Emma nodded, her eyes wide but filled with trust. "Be careful, Jake," she whispered. Jake gave her a reassuring look before turning his attention back to the fight. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire and shouting, the metallic clatter of weapons clashing, and the heavy breaths of men who knew this battle could end their lives. Jake and Steele moved with precision, taking out the Brotherhood's men one by one, their training and experience making them a deadly force. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, each movement fueled by the knowledge that this fight was about more than just survival. It was about taking back everything that had been stolen from him, and from Emma. He moved swiftly, his gun raised, eyes scanning the room. He spotted Marcus again, standing near the back door, his face twisted with rage. "You can't win this, Jake," Marcus yelled, his voice filled with venom. "You're outnumbered. You're nothing." Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. He was done with the lies. Done with the manipulation. It was time to end this. With a swift motion, Jake and Steele closed the gap between them and Marcus, their eyes locked on the man who had once been their ally. Marcus's face twisted with frustration as he reached for his gun. But before he could pull the trigger, Steele lunged forward, knocking the weapon from his hand and pinning him to the ground. Jake stood over him, his gun aimed directly at Marcus's chest. "It's over," Jake said, his voice cold. Marcus's eyes widened with shock, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. But there were no more words left. The truth had been uncovered, and the power Marcus had once wielded was gone. He was nothing now. Jake pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot rang out, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As Marcus's body fell to the floor, Jake knew this fight wasn't over. The Brotherhood was still out there, still dangerous. But they had taken the first step, and they weren't going to stop until every last secret was exposed. The room fell silent after the shot rang out, the echo lingering in the air like a final exhale. Marcus lay motionless on the cold concrete floor, his eyes wide open, his last breath already taken. Jake stood over him, the gun still in his hand, the weight of the moment sinking in. The anger, the betrayal, the years of pain. It all culminated in this one violent moment. But it wasn't over. The storm outside raged on, but inside the warehouse, the battle was far from finished. The Brotherhood was still out there, and Marcus was just one piece of the puzzle. Jake felt a deep sense of finality, but also a gnawing feeling of dread. The job wasn't done yet. He turned to Steele, his face hard as stone. "This isn't over," Jake said, his voice low. Steele nodded, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting more trouble. "No," Steele said, his voice grim. "This is just the beginning. There's more to this than just Marcus. We need to find the rest of the Brotherhood, take them down, and make sure they don't have a chance to strike back." Jake looked at Emma, who was still crouched behind the crates. She was scared, he could see that in her eyes. But there was something else there too, a quiet resolve. She had been through so much already, but she wasn't backing down now. She wasn't running. And neither was he. "We'll finish this," Jake said, his tone resolute. "But we need to be careful. The rest of the Brotherhood won't go down without a fight. We need to find their leader, figure out who's still pulling the strings." Steele stepped forward, his expression unwavering. "I know where they are," he said, his voice steady. "There's a safe house just outside the city. It's where they regroup. If we're going to take them down, that's where we need to go." Jake nodded. "Lead the way." The three of them moved quickly through the warehouse, making their way toward the exit. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty space, the only noise in the otherwise silent night. As they stepped out into the rain, Jake felt the cold air bite at his skin. The storm had picked up again, but he didn't care. The cold didn't matter. The rain didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was finishing what they had started. They made their way to the motorcycle, and Jake revved the engine, the sound cutting through the night like a sharp blade. Steele climbed onto his own bike, his movements quick and efficient, while Emma climbed on behind Jake. As they rode through the streets, Jake's mind was consumed with thoughts of Marcus, the Brotherhood, and the deep web of lies that had ensnared them all. He had never imagined his life would lead him here, but now that they were so close to the end, he knew he couldn't stop. He couldn't go back. The safe house wasn't far, but Jake could already feel the weight of what was to come. The Brotherhood wasn't going to give up easily, but he was done running. He was done hiding. The storm raged as they reached the outskirts of the city, and the safe house loomed ahead, a dark and foreboding structure in the distance. Jake's eyes narrowed as he saw the outline of the building in the distance. They had made it this far. There was no turning back now. They approached the entrance cautiously, Jake scanning the area for any signs of danger. The safe house was quiet, the windows dark and empty. But Jake knew better than to let his guard down. The Brotherhood was always watching. They were always waiting for the right moment to strike. "This is it," Steele said, his voice steady. "We move quickly. We take them down before they even know we're here." Jake nodded, his heart racing. He wasn't about to let anyone stand in their way. They had come this far, and they weren't stopping now. The rain poured down harder as they dismounted their bikes and made their way to the back of the building. Steele led the way, his movements fluid and practiced. Jake and Emma followed closely behind, their steps silent in the wet night. They reached the back door, and Steele checked the lock. "It's open," he said, his voice low. Without a word, they slipped inside, moving quickly and quietly through the dark hallways. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by their soft footfalls. Jake's hand rested on the grip of his gun, ready for anything. The Brotherhood was here, and they were going to face them head-on. They made their way down the hallway, and as they turned the corner, Jake's heart stopped. There, standing at the end of the hall, was the leader of the Brotherhood, the man who had been pulling the strings from the beginning. Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was someone he never expected, someone he knew all too well. "It's you," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The leader smiled, his eyes cold and filled with contempt. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're just a pawn in a game far bigger than you, Jake. You've always been a pawn. And now, it's checkmate." Jake's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had walked into this trap, but he wasn't going to be the one to lose. He wasn't going to let Emma, or himself, become another casualty of the Brotherhood's game. The fight was far from over, and Jake wasn't going to back down. He was ready for whatever came next. It was time to finish this, once and for all. The leader of the Brotherhood stood at the end of the hallway, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, calculating. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he recognized him. It was someone he never thought he'd see again, someone he had trusted, someone who had been like a brother. But now, standing in front of him, the man seemed like a stranger, his cold smile twisted with something far darker. "You," Jake muttered, barely able to form the words. The man's lips curled into a smirk. Yes, Jake, he said, his voice calm, but the venom was clear. Did you really think it would be this easy? The man took a step forward, his boots echoing in the otherwise silent hall. Steele, standing beside Jake, stiffened, his eyes darting around, scanning for any signs of other Brotherhood members lurking nearby. You've been chasing ghosts, the man continued, his tone almost mocking. You've been running for so long, thinking you could escape it. But you can't, Jake. You never could. Jake felt his heart pounding in his chest, the anger rising like a tidal wave. The betrayal, the lies, the endless years of being manipulated, it was all crashing down on him. The man, who had once been his mentor, his guide, was nothing more than a puppet master pulling the strings from the shadows. I should have known, Jake said, his voice low but steady. You were always the one pulling the strings. Always the one in control. The man's smile widened. Of course I was, he said, almost gleeful. I was always the one who understood the bigger picture. You were just a pawn, Jake. A tool to get what I wanted. You never even realized it, did you? Jake's fist clenched. The pain of the years he had wasted, the trust he had placed in this man, all of it crashed over him in a single, searing wave. I trusted you, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. And you threw it all away. You threw me away. The man's eyes darkened, his expression shifting from amusement to cold indifference. Trust, he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. You were never meant to be anything more than a means to an end. You should have known better than to believe that you were anything special. The anger in Jake surged again, and before he could stop himself, he lunged forward, his fist connecting with the man's jaw. The impact reverberated through the hallway, and for a moment, everything stood still. The man staggered back, a shocked expression crossing his face for just a second before he regained his balance. You're pathetic, Jake, he sneered, wiping the blood from his lip. You still don't get it, do you? The Brotherhood isn't just about power. It's about survival. And you've always been weak. That's why you couldn't see it. Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had heard enough. This was no longer about words. This was about action. Steele, who had been silent, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing with a quiet fury. You've hurt enough people, Steele said, his voice ice cold. It's time for this to end. The man laughed, a bitter sound that filled the hallway. You think you can stop me? You're nothing, he said. Nothing but a memory waiting to fade. Jake felt his pulse quicken. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about stopping the cycle of destruction this man had caused. With a quick motion, Jake drew his gun, the weight of it familiar in his hand. The man froze, his eyes widening in realization. You're making a mistake, the man said, his voice suddenly wavering. You don't know what you're doing. Jake stepped closer, his gun trained on the man's chest. I know exactly what I'm doing, Jake said, his voice firm, unwavering. You've hurt too many people. You've destroyed too many lives. And I'm putting an end to it now. The man opened his mouth to say something, but Jake wasn't listening anymore. The words didn't matter. What mattered was putting an end to this, ending the game that had been played with so many lives, including his own. He pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and final, echoing in the empty hallway. The man crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless before it even hit the floor. Jake stood there for a moment, staring at the body, his heart pounding in his chest. But there was no relief. There was no victory. Only the hollow emptiness of knowing that this wasn't over. Not yet. The Brotherhood was still out there, and there was more to be done. Jake turned away from the body, his hand still gripping the gun. He looked at Steele, who gave him a curt nod. Steele didn't speak. There was no need. The next move was clear. They couldn't waste any more time. Emma, who had been standing silently behind them, her face pale and tense, stepped forward. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see the quiet strength in her eyes. She had been through so much already, and yet, she wasn't afraid. Not now. We need to move, Jake said, his voice steady. There's still more to do. We can't stop now. Steele and Emma followed him without hesitation, and the three of them made their way deeper into the safe house. But as they moved through the shadows, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. There were still questions to answer, still enemies to face. The final battle wasn't over, and Jake knew that the real fight was just beginning. The moment they stepped deeper into the safe house, Jake could feel the weight of what they had just done. Marcus was gone, but the war wasn't over. The Brotherhood was still out there, and the remaining pieces of the puzzle were just beginning to fall into place. They couldn't afford to rest now. As they moved further through the dimly lit corridors, Jake's thoughts raced, his mind calculating the next move. Every step he took felt heavier, like each decision was pushing him closer to something bigger, something more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Emma, walking quietly beside him, kept her gaze forward, but Jake could see the shadow of fear still clouding her eyes. She had seen too much, learned too much, but she wasn't backing down. She was in this with him now, and that made all the difference. Steele moved ahead, his body tensed, alert. The familiar, cold intensity of his gaze never wavered. Jake trusted him more than anyone, and at that moment, he felt like Steele was the only one who truly understood the gravity of what was happening. They were in enemy territory now. The Brotherhood's grip was everywhere, and they needed to dismantle it piece by piece. "We need to find the rest of their operations," Jake said, his voice low and determined. "We can't let them regroup. We take out their safe houses, their connections, everything." Steele nodded without hesitation. "Agreed. But we're not the only ones looking. They'll know Marcus is gone soon. They'll come for us." Jake clenched his jaw. The thought of the Brotherhood regrouping made his blood boil. They had been nothing but a constant source of pain and destruction in his life, and now they were trying to erase everything he and Emma had worked for. "We'll be ready," Jake said, his voice firm. He wasn't going to let them destroy what was left of his life, or Emma's. The rain outside had stopped, but the night was still heavy with the promise of more danger. Steele stopped in front of a reinforced door and gestured for Jake to take the lead. "This is it," Steele said, his voice a low murmur. "The last stronghold." Jake's heart raced as he stepped forward. This was the moment that would decide everything. Behind this door lay the answers they needed. Information on the Brotherhood's remaining leaders, their plans, and where to strike next. But it wasn't going to be easy. They had already fought their way this far, but the real fight was still ahead of them. Jake turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room inside was dimly lit, filled with stacks of documents, old weapons, and surveillance equipment. It looked like a command center, a place where the Brotherhood planned and coordinated their every move. Jake's eyes scanned the room, his mind moving a mile a minute as he processed the contents. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a strategic hub, and it was exactly what they needed. Steele moved in first, immediately starting to sift through the documents scattered across the tables. Jake stood back for a moment, his gaze flicking to Emma. She was taking everything in, her face still pale, but her expression resolute. "We need to find everything we can," Jake said, snapping out of his thoughts and moving to one of the desks. He picked up a stack of papers and flipped through them quickly. Most of them were about business dealings, contracts, and names he didn't recognize. But then, a name jumped out at him. Marcus. Jake's blood ran cold. "He's been planning this for years," Jake muttered, the weight of the realization crashing over him. Marcus had known all along. The betrayal had run deeper than just a few people in the Brotherhood. It was a network, a carefully constructed system of manipulation that extended beyond what anyone could have imagined. "What is it?" Steele asked, his voice sharp. Jake didn't answer immediately. He sifted through the papers, his fingers trembling slightly as he found a map of the city. Lines were drawn across it, each one leading to a different location, marked with red XS. "This is it," Jake said, his voice tight with urgency. "These are their other hideouts. They've been running this whole operation under our noses." Steele moved closer, studying the map. "We take this down, we take them all down." Jake looked at Emma, her eyes wide as she looked at the map, trying to process what they were seeing. "We're not done yet," Jake said, his voice low but filled with a quiet rage. "But we're getting closer." The plan was clear. They had to hit the remaining strongholds. They had to take down every last member of the Brotherhood before they could regroup. Jake felt a surge of determination. This was his chance to finally put an end to the nightmare that had haunted him for so long. As Steele gathered the remaining documents, Jake stood tall, his resolve hardening with each passing second. "Let's finish this," Jake said, his voice filled with certainty. The pieces were falling into place, and there was no turning back now. They had the information they needed. They knew where to go next. The Brotherhood had no idea what was coming. But Jake did. and he wasn't going to stop until every last one of them was brought to justice. With a final look at the room, Jake turned toward the door, Emma following close behind. Steele was already ahead of them, ready to move out. The storm outside might have passed, but the real battle was just beginning. They were going to end this together. The warehouse was eerily quiet as Jake, Steele, and Emma stood together, the weight of their mission hanging over them. It had been a long journey, filled with danger, betrayal, and hard decisions. But now, they were here, ready to take down the final remnants of the Brotherhood. The city outside was still, the faint sound of sirens and the distant hum of traffic offering an odd contrast to the tension within the warehouse walls. The Brotherhood's operations had been decimated, and Marcus was gone. But they knew better than to think it was truly over. There would always be another threat, another challenge. Steele stood by the table, studying the documents they had gathered. His eyes narrowed as he flipped through the pages, clearly deep in thought. Jake glanced at him, his mind still processing everything they had uncovered. "Steele," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "Is there anything else we're missing?" Steele looked up, meeting Jake's gaze. "We've hit them hard, but the Brotherhood's reach is wide," Steele replied. "There might be smaller cells, people loyal to the cause, even after everything's fallen apart. But this," he motioned to the pile of documents, "this is the end of their main operations. We've done what we came here to do." Jake nodded, a sense of finality settling over him. For the first time in years, the burden that had weighed him down seemed to lift. But as he glanced at Emma, he realized that the road ahead wasn't just about bringing down an organization. It was about rebuilding. "What happens now?" Emma asked, her voice soft but strong. She was no longer the frightened little girl who had stumbled into this world of darkness. She was someone who had faced the storm head-on and had come out stronger. Jake smiled, though it was a tired, worn smile. "Now we move on," he said, his voice steady. "We finish this chapter, but we start a new one. A better one." Steele was quiet for a moment, then nodded, as if accepting the unspoken weight of Jake's words. "You're right. There's always more work to do. But for tonight, we've won." Jake turned toward the door, his eyes scanning the quiet, empty streets outside. It was a strange feeling, knowing that their fight was finally over. He could see the faint outline of the city's skyline in the distance, the lights flickering as dawn began to break. It felt like a new beginning, but Jake knew the past would always be there, lurking just behind him. "You're not alone in this anymore," Steele said, stepping up beside Jake. "Whatever comes next, we've got your back." Jake looked over at Steele and nodded. He had come to trust Steele more than anyone in the world, and he knew that together, they could face anything. "Thanks, Steele," Jake said quietly. "For everything." "No need for thanks," Steele replied. "You've earned it." As they walked out of the warehouse, Emma following closely behind, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settling over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face whatever came next. They had survived the storm. They had brought down the Brotherhood. And now, they could rebuild, piece by piece, without the weight of betrayal and fear hanging over them. As they rode through the city, the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the horizon. It was a new day, a fresh start. Jake glanced at Emma, her face illuminated by the soft light. She had made it through the darkness, and so had he. The future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, Jake was ready to face it head-on. Together,